The start of 1943 was a difficult time for Nazi Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad was all but lost, with the 6th Army surrounded and mere days from surrender. In the Mediterranean, the success of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, had forced the withdrawal of German and Italian troops into Tunisia. Nevertheless, back in Berlin, the Nazis were planning a celebration. The 30th of January 1943 marked the 10-year anniversary of Hitler's takeover of power. The day was to be a national work-free holiday, albeit a very carefully orchestrated one with a clear propaganda message. But the RAF were keen to send their own message. This is the story of how the RAF humiliated the senior Nazi leadership with one of the most audacious raids in the entire war. News of the upcoming celebrations made its way back to Britain. Keen to join in on the festivities, the RAF began planning what would be the first daylight raid on the German capital. Hermann Goring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, was due to deliver a speech at 11 a.m. from the Air Ministry building. Later that afternoon, Propaganda Minister Goebbels was due to speak at 4 p.m. at the Berlin Sportpalast. He was speaking in place of Hitler, who was simply too overwhelmed by the imminent defeat in Stalingrad to take part. Both speeches were to be broadcast live on the radio across the entire Reich. The radio set that most of the German population would be using to listen to the broadcast was called the Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver 301. This name, abbreviated to the VE 301, was actually a reference to the very day they were celebrating, the 30th of January, the day Hitler became Chancellor. The production of an affordable radio receiver was instigated by Goebbels himself, who was acutely aware of the power of radio to spread his propaganda to every corner of Germany. The VE 301 was incredibly popular, with millions of sets being sold. This, alongside the building of larger radio towers across Germany, resulted in nearly 80 million people now being able to tune in and listen to party speeches delivered live. But instead of party speeches, the RAF sought to broadcast the sound of Merlin engines and air raid sirens. Two separate flights, each made up of 3 Mosquito bombers, would depart RAF Marham in Norfolk, cross the North Sea, then fly across hundreds of miles of occupied enemy territory and finally drop their bombs, interrupting both speeches. And if all this wasn't quite dangerous enough, the whole mission would have to be flown at a precariously low altitude in order to avoid detection by radar. The task of pulling off this audacious raid fell to the pilots of 105 Squadron and 139 Jamaica Squadron and their Mosquito B Mark IVs. The Mosquito, or Wooden Wonder as it was nicknamed because, well, it was made of wood, was one of the first multi-role combat aircraft and one ideally suited to this mission. Its wooden construction and pair of powerful Merlin engines afforded the aircraft several advantages. But it was sheer speed that gave it the ability to outrun and avoid enemy fighters. On the morning of the 30th of January 1943, the 3 crews from 105 Squadron each boarded their Mosquitoes and fired up their powerful Merlin V12 engines. The dangers of the upcoming flight were not lost on the crew, with some of them understandably too nervous to eat breakfast. The first raid was to be led by Squadron Leader Reggie Reynolds and his navigator Pilot Officer Ted Daisy Sismore. Flying with them in DZ-408 were Flight Lieutenant John Flash Gordon and Flying Officer Ralph Hayes. And lastly, in DZ-372 were Flying Officer Tony Wickham alongside Navigator Pilot Officer Bill Macon. They took off from Morrow at 8:45 in the morning in poor weather and headed east towards the coastline and out into the North Sea. They hit the Dutch coast and, flying just above the rooftops of occupied Europe, began the next perilous leg of their mission. They finally reached the German city of Nuremberg, where they began to climb all the way up to 25,000 feet. Now closing in on Berlin, they prepared to drop their bombs. Below them was a layer of cloud, but as they approached their target, they spotted a gap in the weather. And right on time, after flying over 500 miles in bad weather, they dropped their bombs, right as Goring began to speak at 11 a.m. Muffled explosions could be heard on the radio. Anti-aircraft fire and air raid sirens wailed in the background. In a panic, the radio station didn't really know what to do. Eventually, they cut off the live broadcast and chose to play music instead. Goring was beside himself with anger. It was humiliating for the Reichsmarschall, having said himself that enemy aircraft would never fly over Germany. With the first raid of the day completed, the 3 Mosquitoes turned for home. They had caught the German defences off guard, and aside from some light flak over Bremen, the return trip was uneventful. All 3 aircraft landed safely back at Marham. Just before the return of 105 Squadron, 139 Jamaica Squadron took off for the second daring raid of the day, also into very poor weather. DZ-367 was piloted by Squadron Leader Donald Darling with Navigator Flying Officer Bill Wright, DZ-379 by Sergeants Joe Massey and Richard Lofty Fletcher, and DK-337 by Flight Sergeant Pete McGeehan of the Royal New Zealand Air Force with Flying Officer Reg Morris. They flew a similar route to 105 Squadron, keeping low across the North Sea, flying north of Heligoland and crossing the Schleswig-Holstein Peninsula. After passing near the port of Lübeck near the Baltic coast, they turned southeast for the final leg to Berlin. As they approached the city, they climbed up to 20,000 feet using the cloud as cover and made their preparations to drop. By the time 139 Squadron arrived over Berlin, German defences were on high alert. At 4 p.m, as Goebbels began his speech at the Sportpalast, they dropped their bombs. Once again, the chaotic sound of Merlin engines, explosions and anti-aircraft fire was broadcast to VE301 radio receivers all over the Reich. This time though, the radio station chose to keep broadcasting the speech live. The 3 Mosquitoes now found themselves dealing with persistent anti-aircraft fire. They turned west to make a break for home, but before they could escape, DZ-367, crewed by Squadron Leader Donald Darling and Flying Officer Bill Wright, was hit by flak and crashed, killing both crew members. To avoid the worst of the anti-aircraft fire, the other 2 Mosquitoes pulled into a dive. Suddenly, they noticed 2 Focke-Wulf 190s heading towards them, but they were going so fast in the dive that fortunately, the enemy fighters were unable to catch them. By 6 p.m, both aircraft had made it back to Marham. After a short interrogation, they were treated to a well-deserved dinner of steak and chips, which, according to New Zealand Flight Sergeant Peter McGeehan, was worth flying to Berlin for. The crews were all decorated for their efforts. Very little damage was actually done to the capital, but that wasn't the point. Instead, what was achieved was a huge propaganda victory, and perhaps it served as a small glimmer of hope to the people of occupied Europe. The raids also provided Bomber Command invaluable information for further attacks on the capital, such as flight times and fuel consumption rates. As the war continued, all 5 of the aircraft flown that day would eventually be destroyed. But more importantly, of the 10 men that returned from the raids, only 5 would survive the war.